Royal jewels don't just sit behind velvet ropes for security. They sit there because distance is part of the construction. Step closer, and some of the most famous tiaras in Europe start to look like they're confessing. There's a reason these pieces are displayed behind velvet ropes, photographed from specific angles, and worn only under controlled lighting. That distance isn't accident or tradition, it's structural. Because scattered across Europe's royal collections are pieces that were engineered to work at exactly 20 feet, no closer, never in daylight, always with the protective blur of ceremony between the jewel and anyone looking at it. They were designed for the theatre of monarchy, ballroom length, chandelier glow, the forgiving distance of state photography. Move within arm's reach, examine them under proper light, and the carefully maintained illusion begins to show its edges. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and turn on notifications. This channel is about the details you're never meant to see up close. Sometimes the only honest inspection report these jewels ever receive comes from the women forced to wear them for hours. The weight alone tells you something went wrong in the design process. Queen Mary's lover's knot tiara might be one of the most recognisable pieces in the British royal collection, worn by Diana, now regularly appearing on Catherine. But its history reveals a fundamental tension between appearance and wearability. In 1914, Queen Mary commissioned Gerard to create a copy of her grandmother's favourite tiara, one that had been sold years earlier and lost to the family. The original belonged to Princess Augusta of Hesse, and Mary wanted it back, or at least a recreation. What she got was technically accurate, but practically punishing. The tiara features 19 hanging pearls suspended from diamond lovers' knot bows, creating that distinctive cascade effect that photographs so beautifully. But each pearl is substantial, and the framework needed to support them had to be correspondingly heavy. The result weighs enough that it's become famous among royal watchers for causing headaches. Diana complained about it, and Catherine has been photographed adjusting it during events. The pearls themselves, while well matched for size and the overall visual effect, show variations when examined closely. Some have the deep luster and perfect surface that characterize the finer specimens. Others display the slight irregularities and surface characteristics common in natural pearls of that era, acceptable for the time, adequate for the effect, but not uniformly exceptional. The diamond settings, while competent, reveal their 1914 origins: solid, functional, prioritizing security over the delicate refinement that characterizes later royal commissions. It creates exactly the effect it was designed for: romantic, feminine, unmistakably regal from across a state dining room. But wear it for 3 hours at a state banquet, and you understand why this particular piece has such a complicated relationship with the women who've actually had to balance it on their heads. When an entire nation selects your gemstones, quality becomes a secondary concern, whether anyone admits it or not. What Brazil's government didn't know was that generosity and quality are not the same thing. In 1953, the people of Brazil decided to give their young queen a magnificent wedding gift, a suite of aquamarines and diamonds that would become one of Elizabeth II's most worn sets. The gesture was genuine and the intention generous, showcase Brazil's famous aquamarine deposits and create something worthy of a newly crowned monarch. The challenge with gemstone gifts from national governments is that selection criteria become political rather than purely aesthetic. The aquamarines needed to be large, impressively, undeniably large, and they needed to come from Brazilian sources. They needed to match each other reasonably well in colour. But individual stone quality, the subtle characteristics that separate exceptional gems from merely adequate ones, became secondary considerations. The resulting tiara, created by Garrod in 1957 from the gifted stones, features aquamarines that are certainly substantial and create a striking visual impact. From the distance of the official photographs, They present as a match set of impressive blue-green stones that complement the diamonds surrounding them. But examine them more carefully, and you notice variations in clarity, differences in the depth and saturation of colour, inclusions visible in several of the larger stones. The diamonds themselves were added by Garrard to complete the design, and they follow the practical approach typical of pieces built around gifted centerpieces. They're there to support and enhance the aquamarines, chosen for their ability to create the right overall effect, rather than for individual perfection. The metalwork is solid and professional, but it shows the constraints of working with stones of predetermined size and proportion. The framework had to accommodate what was given, rather than being designed around ideal materials. It's a piece that Elizabeth II wore regularly, and apparently enjoyed, particularly for events with Commonwealth connections. It does its job remarkably well from the intended viewing distance, creating exactly the impression of generous international friendship and regal splendour that both the givers and the recipient wanted. But it's fundamentally a creation designed around diplomatic gesture rather than optimal gemology. Even superstition has limits when a jeweller has to work with what's already been delivered. The rubies came with instructions about which stones to avoid and which questionable ones to use anyway. When the Burmese government gifted Elizabeth II 96 rubies for her wedding in 1947, they included a piece of advice rooted in local belief: avoid stones with too much purple or brown, as these were thought to bring bad fortune. It was a thoughtful addition to a generous gift, giving the young princess both gems and guidance. 26 years later, when Elizabeth commissioned Garrard to create a tiara from those rubies, practical reality intervened. 96 rubies sounds impressive, but not all rubies are created equal, and the variation within the gift was significant. Some were genuinely fine specimens with that deep, pure red that makes Burmese rubies so prized. Others showed exactly the characteristics the Burmese had warned against: purple overtones, brownish tints, inclusions that affected their clarity and brilliance. The resulting tiara, completed in 1973, had to work with what was available. The design incorporates diamond roses with rubies at their centres, creating a delicate, feminine piece that photographs beautifully. But the rubies themselves tell the story of compromise. The variation in colour is noticeable under proper examination. Some stones show that perfect pigeon's blood red, others lean toward purple, still others display the slightly muddier tones of lower grade material. Garrard's solution was clever. Use the best stones in the most visible positions, deploy the less perfect specimens where they'd be seen less clearly, and rely on the overall design to create visual cohesion from normal viewing distances. The diamonds help. Their brilliance draws the eye and creates sparkle that somewhat distracts from the ruby variations. It's a piece built around making the most of what was given, and in that context, it succeeds. The symbolism remains powerful, a gift from Burma, worn by the Queen at events where that connection matters. But it's also a reminder that even royal jewellers sometimes have to work with materials that fall short of ideal, finding ways to create beauty despite limitations, rather than because of perfection. The more often a tiara is taken apart, the harder it becomes to pretend it was ever a single unified idea. Every modification leaves traces that no amount of polish can quite erase. The Cambridge Emerald Tiara has lived several lives across more than a century, and each transformation is written into its current form if you know how to read the evidence. The piece originated as a wedding gift to Princess Mary Adelaide, Duchess of Teck, in 1866, a substantial necklace and matching ornaments featuring diamonds and cabochon emeralds. Queen Mary inherited these pieces, and following her characteristic approach to jewellery, immediately set about transforming them. In 1911, she had Garrard convert portions into a tiara, then modified it again in the 1920s. The framework was adjusted, stones were repositioned, the overall structure was refined to match evolving tastes and her changing needs. Each of these interventions left marks. The emeralds themselves, while genuine and reasonably impressive, show the patina and surface characteristics of stones that have been remounted multiple times. Several display the slight scratches and wear patterns that develop when gems are repeatedly set and reset. The gold framework examined closely reveals solder joins from different periods, sections where metalwork was added or reinforced, areas where the finishing doesn't quite match because it was done in different workshops decades apart. The diamonds surrounding the emeralds vary in cut and quality. Some are clearly Victorian in their proportions, others show characteristics of later periods, suggesting that stones were added or replaced as modifications occurred. The overall effect from across a room is certainly grand and appropriately regal. But approach it closely and you're looking at a piece that carries its history visibly, showing the accumulated evidence of a century of alterations. It's perfectly functional for its current purpose, grand enough for major state occasions, historically significant enough to merit its place in the collection. But it's fundamentally a creation shaped by circumstance and modification rather than a unified vision executed with consistent materials and craftsmanship. Jewels rescued through chaos rarely arrive intact, no matter how romantic the story sounds afterward. What the photographs never mentioned was how this tiara came to exist at all. The Grand Duchess Vladimir tiara occupies a unique place in British royal history because it arrived through adventure rather than inheritance or commission. When Grand Duchess Maria Pavlovna died in 1920, her daughter, Grand Duchess Eleanor, was desperate to salvage some family treasures from revolutionary Russia. The tiara had already been smuggled out of the Vladimir Palace, hidden in a British diplomat's luggage, moved through danger and uncertainty, finally reaching safety abroad. Eleanor eventually sold it to Queen Mary in 1921, and it entered the British collection not as a purpose-built royal commission, but as a rescued survivor of political catastrophe. Queen Mary had it adapted, creating mechanisms to swap the original pearl drops for emeralds, giving the piece two distinct identities depending on which stones were installed. But rescuing a tiara from revolution and adapting it for a new owner creates inevitable compromises. The original framework, designed for a different wearer with different proportions and preferences, had to be modified to work for Queen Mary and later for Elizabeth II. Those modifications show in the structure, reinforcements added where the original proved too delicate, adjustments made to the fitting mechanisms, alterations to accommodate the swappable stones. The pearls and emeralds themselves, while certainly valuable and visually impressive, weren't selected as match sets chosen specifically for this piece. They were what was available, what could be sourced, what worked with the existing framework. From the distance of the official photographs, especially in the dramatic emerald version, it looks spectacular. But examined closely, you can see it's fundamentally an assembled piece, valuable components brought together through circumstance rather than created as a unified whole. It carries remarkable history and undeniable presence, but it also shows what happens when jewellery survives through adaptation rather than careful preservation. It becomes something slightly different, marked by the compromises required for its survival and transformation. This piece was designed for a woman who was never supposed to become queen. That mismatch never fully disappeared. The tiara was never meant to bear this kind of scrutiny because its wearer was never meant to reign. The Strathmore rose tiara represents a category of royal jewellery that's particularly interesting. Pieces created for aristocrats who unexpectedly became queens. In 1923, when Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon married the Duke of York, her father commissioned this tiara as a wedding gift. It was meant to be beautiful and impressive, certainly, but appropriate for a duchess, not for a queen consort. The design is charming and personal. 5 diamond wild roses that can be removed and worn as individual brooches, giving the young Duchess versatility in her jewellery. The framework came in 2 forms, a bandeau style fashionable in the 1920s and a traditional tiara setting. For a duke's wife with a normal trajectory ahead of her, it was perfect. Then her husband unexpectedly became King George VI in 1936, and suddenly this lovely family jewel had to serve in context far more grand than anyone imagined when it was commissioned. The diamonds, while genuine and pleasant, were selected by an earl with aristocratic tastes and an aristocratic budget, not by a monarch with access to the finest stones in Europe. They're perfectly acceptable, creating a lovely sparkle and forming recognisable floral shapes. But they lack the exceptional clarity and colour grade that would typically appear in crown jewels. The metalwork too reflects its original purpose. It's well crafted and charming, with the kind of attention to detail you'd expect from a good jeweller serving a wealthy family. But it doesn't have the museum quality finishing, the extraordinary precision, or the use of the absolute finest materials that characterises pieces commissioned specifically as crown jewels. When it reappeared in 2023 on the Princess of Wales, it created a sensation, partly because it's genuinely pretty, partly because of its family connection and century of history. But it succeeds because it's being worn exactly as intended, by a princess at formal events where its charm and symbolism matter more than absolute material perfection. It was never designed to compete with the state crowns and historic parures. It was designed to make a young duchess sparkle, and at that, it still succeeds beautifully. When a tiara is assembled from what's available rather than what's ideal, the camera becomes its best ally. Its secret is written in the very name it carries, Meander, suggesting a piece that wandered through several forms before finding its current shape. Princess Andrew's Meander tiara arrived in the British Royal Collection as a wedding gift in 1947, given by Prince Philip's mother to her new daughter-in-law. The design is elegant and meaningful, a Greek key pattern in diamonds topped by a central laurel wreath, connecting Philip's Greek heritage to his new role in the British royal family. But this tiara had already lived one life before it arrived in England. It was created originally for Princess Alice, almost certainly assembled from stones and elements she had available rather than commissioned as a unified whole with carefully selected materials. The Greek royal family in the early 20th century faced the same financial realities as other European monarchies. Ceremony required jewels, but budgets had limits. The result is a tiara that works beautifully as symbol and ornament from appropriate distances, but shows its composite origins under close examination. The diamonds vary noticeably in quality and cutting style, suggesting they were gathered from various sources rather than selected as a match set. Some display the earlier cutting techniques with different proportions and light performance than their neighbours. The colour varies enough that you can distinguish individual stones rather than seeing a unified field of white brilliance. The framework itself, while certainly competent, lacks the extraordinary precision that characterises the finest royal jewellery. Settings are secure and functional, but they're not invisible. You can see the metalwork, observe where different sections were joined together, notice where the structure prioritises holding stones safely over creating seamless visual perfection. Elizabeth II apparently recognised this. She never wore the tiara publicly, eventually passing it to Princess Anne, who used it regularly. It works wonderfully for a princess at state functions and formal photographs. But perhaps it was always meant for that level, rather than for a reigning monarch, which might explain why it passed so quickly from Elizabeth's hands to Anne's. Some tiaras succeed precisely because they were never meant to impress anyone up close. There's something almost poignant about a tiara specifically designed to be unimpressive. The Cartier halo tiara was purchased in 1936 by the Duke of York for his wife, a sweet gift for a duchess with a modest jewellery collection. Created by Cartier in their signature delicate scroll style, it features diamonds arranged in a graceful, feminine pattern that photographs beautifully without overwhelming the wearer. And that was exactly what it needed to be. Appropriate for a duchess, elegant without being ostentatious, suitable for someone who wasn't yet at the centre of royal ceremony. The diamonds reflect those requirements. They're genuine, certainly, and well cut for their era. But they were selected with a budget and a purpose that didn't include comparison with the crown jewels. Many are smaller than what would appear in a major state tiara, chosen to create delicate visual effect rather than dramatic impact. The Duchess of York wore her new tiara occasionally in the late 1930s. Then her husband became king, she became queen, and suddenly the halo looked rather too modest for her new position. So it was passed to their daughter as an 18th birthday gift in 1944. Appropriate again, because it was always meant for a princess. And it's remained a princess's tiara ever since. Princess Margaret wore it, Princess Anne claimed it as a signature piece for years, and then Catherine borrowed it for her wedding day in 2011. Each time it appears, it creates exactly the effect it was designed for. Delicate, elegant, refined without being overpowering. But that's because it's being worn by women who suit its scale and origins. If you examine it closely, which most people never do because it's typically photographed from wedding ceremony distances, you see exactly what it is. A lovely piece of 1930s Cartier work commissioned for a specific purpose and price point. The diamonds are pleasant rather than exceptional. The metalwork is competent rather than extraordinary. The overall conception is charming rather than magnificent. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's successful because it knows exactly what it is and has never tried to be more. Conversion always leaves evidence, especially when jewellery is forced to become something it wasn't designed to be. The story of how this jewellery became a tiara is the story of why it sometimes struggles to be one. The lotus flower tiara began its life as a necklace, a 1923 wedding gift from the Duke of York to his bride, featuring elaborate meander and festoon designs in diamonds and pearls. It was beautiful in that form, created by Garrard specifically to work as a necklace with specific proportions and visual logic. 6 months later, the new Duchess of York decided she needed a tiara and returned to Garrard with a request. Could they please dismantle this beautiful necklace and turn it into a head ornament instead? They could, and they did, adding lotus flower elements and diamond arches to create a tiara framework suitable for the converted components. But jewellery designed to lie against a collarbone doesn't automatically work when repositioned for a forehead, and the conversion shows in the finished piece. The proportions feel slightly off when you examine it closely. Elements that created perfect balance horizontally look somewhat compressed or extended when reoriented vertically. The pearls, which were positioned for necklace logic, sometimes sit at angles that wouldn't be chosen if the piece were designed as a tiara from the beginning. The framework had to be engineered around existing components rather than designed from scratch, which meant compromises in how the metalwork could be structured and finished. You can see where new elements were added to old, where conversion required joining different sections that weren't originally meant to connect, where the overall architecture serves function adequately but lacks the unified elegance of purpose-built design. It worked for the Duchess of York, then passed to Princess Margaret, who wore it regularly. When Catherine appeared in it at a 2013 reception, it created genuine excitement, partly because of its history, partly because conversions and transformations are inherently interesting. But it succeeds because it's being viewed and photographed at distances that allow the conversion to read as deliberate design rather than practical compromise. Get close enough to study the actual construction, And you understand why Garrard would probably prefer to design tiaras from scratch rather than convert jewellery never meant for that purpose. The most revealing jewels are the ones everyone knew were compromises before the first stone was ever set. What makes this piece particularly fascinating is that everyone involved knew from the beginning it was a compromise and chose it anyway. The Greville Tiara arrived in royal hands not through commission or inheritance, but through the 1942 bequest of Dame Margaret Greville, a wealthy society hostess who left her extraordinary jewellery collection to the Queen Mother. Among those pieces was this honeycomb tiara, originally created by Boucheron and already modified once by Mrs. Greville herself in 1921. Here's where it gets interesting. This wasn't jewellery created for royalty. It was designed for a wealthy private citizen, commissioned with a private budget, intended for private social occasions rather than state ceremony. The standards were different. High, certainly, because Mrs. Greville had excellent taste and substantial resources, but not the same as if Boucheron had been creating something they knew would represent monarchy itself. The diamonds, while numerous and arranged to create impressive honeycomb patterns, reflect those private commission realities. They're generally good quality, creating the necessary sparkle and presence, but they show more variation in colour and clarity than you'd typically see in a tiara purpose built as a crown jewel. Some stones have faint yellow tints, others show minor inclusions, characteristics that blur into general brilliance from across a ballroom but become noticeable under close examination. The framework also carries the evidence of its journey from private hands to royal use. The original Boucheron construction was modified by Mrs. Greville, then adjusted again by the Queen Mother in 1953, and each intervention added layers of adaptation and repair that show in the finished piece. It's been reinforced where the original proved delicate, adjusted where different wearers needed different proportions, maintained through decades of use that have left their subtle marks. The Queen Mother wore it constantly, making it her signature piece. But when Elizabeth II inherited it in 2002, she never wore it publicly, perhaps recognising that its origins and construction placed it in a different category from the state jewels. Instead, she loaned it to Camilla, who has worn it regularly, making it once again a signature piece for someone occupying that interesting space between private aristocrat and full monarch. It's beautiful, historically significant, and genuinely valuable. But it's also fundamentally a piece that began outside the highest tier of royal jewellery and carries those origins in ways that become visible under scrutiny, even as it performs its current ceremonial role beautifully from appropriate distances. These 10 pieces, scattered across Europe's royal collections and Britain's royal vaults, reveal something essential about how we understand crown jewels. We imagine them as perfect objects, flawless embodiments of absolute luxury, pieces where every stone was chosen for its supreme quality and every detail was executed without compromise. And certainly, some royal jewellery meets that standard. But many pieces exist in a more complicated space, created during financial constraints, assembled from gifts that came with predetermined materials, converted from jewellery designed for other purposes, or rescued from circumstances that required adaptation rather than careful preservation. They were designed to create specific effects from specific distances, to work within the theatrical context of monarchy, where lighting is controlled, viewing positions are managed, and the overall impression matters more than whether every individual component would satisfy a gemologist's close examination. They continue to serve their purposes magnificently, creating presence at state occasions, connecting current royalty to dynastic history, providing the visual vocabulary that ceremony requires. But they also remind us that even in the rarefied world of crown jewels, practical realities shape outcomes. Not everything that appears magnificent from across a ballroom maintains that magic when you stand close enough to see the truth behind the spectacle. And perhaps that distance, that careful management of how and where and when these pieces appear, was always part of the design. Thank you for watching. If you'd like to see more stories like this, please consider subscribing. I look forward to seeing you in the next chapter of royal history.